Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Mem Hey, Daf 45 of Masechta Yevamos. Friends, who can tell me what Daf Mem Hey talks about? Well, Daf Mem Hey talks about what happens when a Gentile has sleeps with a Jewess and there's a baby. So what's the status of that baby? Well, that's, I'd say, pretty much, basically, the theme of today's daf. Friends, let's jump in. Around daf Mem Daled Beis, 3 lines from the bottom. Rab Bar Chana Rabbi Yochanan. Says Rab Bar Chana in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Hakamodim be'evid v'ovid kechovim. Everyone agrees that by a Canaanite slave and a idol worshipper, Haba Bas Yisrael, who has relations with a Jewess, Shavol ad Mamzer, that the child is a Mamzer. Okay? Manakomodim, everyone agrees. Who is everybody? Even Shimon HaTimni. Dafagav de Omar, Shimon HaTimni, ein Mamzer, Michai V'Lavin. Even though Shimon HaTimni's opinion is that there are no mamzers from Chai V'Lavin, right? We saw that was Shimon HaTimni's opinion, that mamzers can only be from like ervas and chiyuv karises. So, but a lav. So, for example, if you marry, right, if you do chalitza and then you marry the woman you do chalitza with, so that's a lav, right? So, if you violate that lav, so Shimon HaTimni would say that the child is not a mamzer. However, by an eved and a ovid kochavim that sleep with a bas Yisrael, with the Jewess, so then the child would be a mamzer. So we're explaining that according to Shimon HaTimni, he says that when we say that by Chai V'Lavin the child is not a mamzer, that's by relationships that, although prohibited, kiddushin nonetheless is chal, right? And so if a person marries somebody who he did chalitza with, so while he's over on a lav, technically speaking, there is still kiddushin, and I guess they would have to get separated with a get. Aval, but hacha over kchovim ve'eved came to lo tafsibu kiddushin kechai v'kreisus dami. But in this case, that if you have an Ovid Kochavim or an Eved who sleeps with a Jewish woman, where there is no Kiddushin, there can't be any, Jewish marriage between a non-Jew or an Ev or a Canaanite slave and a Jewish woman. So therefore, in that case, the child would actually be a mamzer. So where Shimon HaTimni says the child is not a mamzer, is where it's just a lav, right? It's where it's a lav and kiddushin would be tofes. But in this case, with an eved and an ovid kochavim and a bas Yisrael, where kiddushin is not tofes, so the child would be a mamzer. Meisvei, we have a kasha. What's this kasha? Ovid kochavim ve'eved haba bas Yisrael havlad mamzer. So the Tanakama says that in ovid kochavim or an eved who sleeps with a bas Yisrael, so the child is a mamzer. Reb Shimon ben Yehuda Omer says, Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, ein mamzer el mimisha isuro isur erev anush kares, that a mamzer is only in a situation where the relationship is one that would be erva, that would be a prohibited relationship, ve'anush kares, and there is a chiyuv kares. In that case, the child is a mamzer. So, what do we see? So, this seems to be like the opinion of Shimon HaTimni, right? Shimon HaTimni is saying that mamzer applies when it's a Isser Erev and a Chiyuv Kares. That seems to be the opinion of Shimon HaTimni. And at the same time, he also seems to be arguing with the Tanakama, right? Whereas the Tanakama says that in Eved and Ovid Kochavim, who sleep with the Bas Yisrael, the child is a mamzer. This opposing opinion of Reb Shimon ben Yehuda is that the child is not a mamzer, because there's only a mamzer from Erva where there's a Chiyuv Kares. So therefore implying that Shimon HaTimni, who seems to hold that way as well, would say that the child would not be a mamzer. Elo Amar Rav Yosef, rather says Rav Yosef, Mana Kol Modum. So when we say that everyone agrees that an Eved and an Oved Kochavim who sleeps with the Bas Yisrael, the child is a mamzer. So then who's everybody? So Rebbe. It's Rebbe. And Rebbe says that in this relationship the child would be a mamzer. Afagav the Rebbe Omer, even though Rebbe says in a different case, right? In a situation where, you know, if Reuven does chalitza with Sarah and then he remarries her, so it says over there, Ein advarim, right? Ein advarim alalu amurim ela divrei Rabbi Akiva. So over there, Rabbi Akiva says that Rebbe says that according to Rabbi Akiva, if Reuven was to do chalitza with Sarah and then they get married, so Rebbe is saying that it's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva that they would not need to get a get because it's not kiddushin bichlal, because it's considered like an erva. Shahaya osa chalutza ke'erva, that Rabbi Akiva would treat chalutza as an erva. V'leilo svirle, but Rebbe does not agree with that. But he does nonetheless agree that by an Oved Kochavim and an Eved, it would be considered an erva, that if an Oved Kochavim or an Eved sleeps with a Bas Yisrael, then it would be an erva and the child would be a mamzer. Also, Rav Dimi, Amr Yitzchak bar Uvdimi Mishum Rabbeinu, that when Rav Dimi came, he said the name of Rav Yitzchak bar Uvdimi, the name of Rebbe, Oved Kochavim ve'Eved, Haba Bas Yisrael Vlad mamzer, that if you have an Oved Kochavim or an Eved who sleeps with a Bas Yisrael, the child is a mamzer. So therefore, when it says that Hakol Modim, that everybody agrees that that if an Eved or an Oved Kochavim sleeps with a Bas Yisrael, the child is mamzer, it means even Rebbe, who disagrees when it comes to chalitza, and he would say that by chalitza the child would not be a mamzer, but by Eved Oved Kochavim the child would be a mamzer. Reb Acha Sar Abira Reb Tanchum Brei Reb Chia Ish Kfar Ako. All right, okay, sounds like a nice pair. So again, Rav Acha Sar Abira. All right, Rav Acha the Sar of the Bira. Reb Tanchum Brei Reb Chia Ish Kfar Ako. Okay. Porokanu Shvuyos also mi Armel Tveria. They redeemed captives who came from Armon to Tveria. Rashi is the Megillah says from Armon to Antuchia. And one of these women, one of these people who was coming from captivity was a woman who was impregnated by one of her non-Jewish captors. They also lekame diribami, and they came before Abami and says, well, what's the status of this yingle? What's the status of this baby, right? Because this baby is a product of a relationship between a Jewish woman and a Gentile. Amalu Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Ami responds to them, well, Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Lozer Rabbi Chanina da Amri V'chom be'ever Abba Bas Yisrael Vlad Mamzer. And Rabbi Ami responds, well, the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Lozer, Rabbi Chanina are all that in this case of an Oved Kochavim and an Eved who is Baal Bas Yisrael, the Vlad would be a mamzer, so this baby would be a mamzer. Rav Yosef Abusal Machashev Gavrei. Rav Yosef responds, and if I understand correctly, he's being sarcastic. He's saying, like, what, are we just listing random opinions? That you're just saying Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Chanina say that in this case the Vlad is a mamzer. Well, guess what? Haravu Shmuel b'Bavel, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi b'Kapar b'Eretz Yisrael, v'Amil l'Chalufi b'Kapar v'Ali Ziknidarim de'Amri. So Rabbi Yosef responds and says, well, just like you listed Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Chanina, well, I'll list Rav and Shmuel in Bavel, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi and Bar Kapar in Eretz Yisrael. Some taka swap out Bar Kapar for the Zikni Darim, whatever it is, but I'll lift you a whole other slew of rabbis, the Amri, that they say, Vlad Kosher, that if you have an Eved and Ovik Kochavim who's Baal Bas Yisrael, the Vlad is take kosher. Oh, so now we're already seeing that there's actually another opinion, which is that an Eved and Ovik Kochavim who's Baal Bas Yisrael, the Vlad, the child, is actually not a mamzer. The child is actually kosher. Elam Rav Yosef Rebbe. So rather, says Rav Yosef, the reason why Rabbi Ami either says or should say that this child that will be born to this woman who conceived in captivity from a Ovik Kochavim, so Rabbi Ami says that the child would be a mamzer. So the reason why that would be is because that's actually the opinion of Rebbe. The opinion of Rebbe is authoritative. The Chiyasar of Dimi, Amr Bitzchak Ba'arav V'Dimi, Mishum Rabbeinu, Amru, that they said in the name of Rebbe, Ovid Kochavim ve'Eved Abba Bas Yisrael, Vlad Mamzer, that if you have an Ovid Kochavim or an Eved who is Ba Bas Yisrael, the Vlad is Taka a Mamzer. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Omer Vlad Mekulkul, whereas Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi argues and says, no, the child is Mekulkul. Man, what does it mean the child is Mekulkul? It's like somehow like defective. So, Ilim the call, if it means that this child is not allowed to marry, anybody, any Jew, so Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Vlad Kosher, but Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was one of those rabbis who said Rav and Shmuel, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi and I believe Bar Kapare, we said a minute ago, that they all say that the Vlad is Taka Kosher. So how can you say that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is saying that the child cannot marry any other Jewish people? Rather, it means that if the child was a girl, so then she would not be allowed to marry a Kohen, the Chula Amoroi, Timachshrei, Modush Vlad Pogum Lechuna. Because even all of these rabbis, Rav, Shmuel, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Bakapara, right, they said the child is kosher, but still they agree that while the child would be kosher, if it's a girl, she wouldn't be allowed to marry a Kohen, right? That they would be Pogum. Or I guess, okay. Yeah, or I guess if it's, well, let's just say that. Okay, that's fine. Fine. And this is from a Kavachomer from the widow that we saw yesterday, I believe. If you have a widow who marries a Kohen Gadol, right? Of course, a widow is allowed to marry a Kohen, but cannot marry a Kohen Gadol. Now, this, of course, doesn't apply to everybody. It only applies to the Kohen Gadol. So this Isser is not sort of across the board. It's specifically by the case of a Kohen Gadol. And yet the child will not be allowed to marry a Kohen. So this situation of an Eved and Ovid Kochavim was Baal Bas Yisrael, that it basically applies to any woman, any Jewish woman. So then certainly then the child would be Pogum, would not be allowed to marry a Kohen. Just like we asked yesterday, yes, but maybe a widow marrying a Kohen Gadol is a particularly stringent case, because in that case not only is the child Pogum, but she herself is Pogum. Well, in this case as well, right, unfortunately, as we've seen in the past, that a woman who, we've seen it in the context of rape, but now we're saying over here as well, that in this case, if a woman becomes pregnant from or has a relationship, or even just sleeps with a non-Jewish fellow, an Eved and Ovid Kochavim, then she herself becomes Pasul Likihuna. So in this case of these women who were in captivity, and one of them became pregnant from one of her Gentile captors, unfortunately she wouldn't be able to marry a Kohen anymore. So here also, she herself is Pasul Likihuna, and the child as well is Pasul Lekehuna. The Amr B'Yochanan Mishum Shimon Minayin Ovid Kochavim Ve'Eved Abba Al Kohenes Ve'Al Viv Al Yisrael Shepsalua, says B'Yochanan the name of Shimon. How do we know that if you have an Ovid Kochavim or an Eved who sleeps with a Kohenes or a Levia or Yisraelis, basically any Jewish woman, She Pisalua, that now she can no longer marry a Kohen? Shenamar, as the pasuk says, Uvas Kohen. Uvas Kohen Kisiya Amana or Grusha. A Bas Kohen if she becomes an Amana or a Grusha, right? So the Torah says in the context of eating Trumah, right? That a Bas Kohen, the daughter of a Kohen, is allowed to eat Trumah. Now, if she gets married to somebody who's not a Kohen, then she can no longer eat Trumah. But if that fellow passes away, she can now eat Trumah once again. Okay, and we're saying that Mishayesh la amonus v'gerishin ba yatzu ovid kochavim ve'eved she'ein loim amonus v'gerishin ba. And says the Gemara, right, that when the pasuk says uvas kohen kisiya amona u'grusha, when she'll be tia, an amona or a grusha, so that means somebody who can actually, right, in a situation where they can actually get married, right? So meaning if you have this Bas Kohen, she gets married to somebody, and then she gets divorced or becomes a widow, so then she can once again eat Truma. But it says the Gemara that specifically in a case where the relationship is such that there actually is almonus and gerushin, i.e. they were actually married, to the exclusion of an Eved and Ovid Kochavim, that the relationship there is not one of actual halachic marriage. It's incapable of being a halachic marriage, and therefore, in that case, she would not, even if that dissolves or whatever, they're no longer together, she would not be able to eat truma anymore. So we see that she becomes mischaleles, right? She herself becomes mischaleles. So we see that in this case, she, right, an Eved Ovid Kochavim was Baal Bas Yisrael, so she herself becomes mischaleles, as well as the offspring would be a chalal as well. Fine. So what have we seen so far? So we've seen a whole bunch of opinions basically about this case, where you have an Eved and Ovid Kochavim who's Baal Bas Yisrael. We've seen a number of Amoraim who said that a bunch of Amoraim, as well as Rebbe, of course, who's a Tana, who say that the child would be a mamzer. We've also seen a bunch of Amoraim, and also Rabbi Shua ben Levi bar Kapara, who were Tanoim, who said that the child would be kosher, but would just be a chalal. So now says, Abaye says, Rav Yosef, the somachta ad Reb Dimi, smoich ad Ravin. So now Abaye says to Rav Yosef, one second, you said that the opinion of Rav Yosef, you said that the opinion of Rebbe is that an Eved over Kochavim Baal Bas Yisrael, the Vlad is a mamzer. However, that was the opinion of Rav Dimi. But there's also the attribution of Ravin, the Chiyasa Ravin, Reb Nosin, Reb Yehuda Anasi, Morim Ba'alei Teireh. But apparently, says Abai, when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said that Reb Nosin and Reb Yehuda Anasi say that the child is mutter. Uman Reb Yehuda Anasi Rebbe. The Reb Yehuda Anasi is Take Rebbe. So apparently, says Abaye, Ravin's opinion is that the child is actually not a mamzer. The Rebbe's opinion is that the child is not a mamzer. V'af Rav mor ba'ater, and Rav also says that the child from an Eved, an Ovid Kochavim, and a Bas Yisrael, the Vlad is not a mamzer. The Ahu, the comment Rav, there was a certain fellow who came before Rav, Omle Ovid Kochavim ve'Eved haba Bas Yisrael mau, and this fellow says to Rav, so if you have an Ovid Kochavim or an Eved who sleeps with a Bas Yisrael, so what about the child? Omle Avlad Kosher. So Rav says the child is kosher. Omle Avli Brato. So then this fellow says, well, guess what? I am the product of such a union. My father is either an Eved, an Ovid Kochavim, and my mother is a Jewess. If you're saying that I'm not a mamzer and I can marry a Jewish woman, right? Just right, who's not a mamzer, any Jewish woman. So right? So havli brato. Let me then marry your daughter, Rav. Lo yehiv nalach. Rav says nope. Or Meshimi bar Chia l'Rav. So then Rav Shimi bar Chia says to Rav, he says, look, Rav, you should really do it. You should really give him your daughter. Amri inche gamla b'modai. That people, when things are kind of distant and things are far away, such as people say that apparently in this faraway place, Madai, there are these big camels that can fit into this tiny little space. Now, you can say what you want. Some faraway place named Madai, all sorts of peculiar things happen. But what happens when you actually go to Madai and you see for yourself that actually they have camels and the camels don't fit into these kind of crazy things, right? So meaning he's saying when something is distant, when something's theoretical, you can say whatever you want, but you also have to back it up when it actually becomes practical. And therefore here we have an example, Rob, of your saying that yes, this theoretical case of an Eved and an Ovid Kochavim who's Baal Bas Yisrael, the child is kosher. But if that's the case, so it's one thing to have a theory and say that it's kosher, but on the other hand, back it up in practice, right? If this fellow is coming and saying that he is the product of such a union, he is the child of such a union, and he's asking to marry your daughter, so back it up with the actions. Give him your daughter. So Omerle says, Rabbi doesn't budge. He says, look, Even if this fellow was like on the level of Yoshua ben Nun. I wonder how he chose Yoshua ben Nun, but okay. Even if he was on the level of Yoshua ben Nun, I would not give him my daughter. Yoshua ben Nun, to which Rav Shimon bar Chiya says to Rav, says, yeah, but look, I mean, if he was on the level of Yoshua ben Nun, so then, we wouldn't really have to worry about him. Fine, so you wouldn't give him your daughter. Fine, he'd move on. He'd marry somebody else. I mean, Yoshua ben Nun shouldn't have such a difficult time finding a shidduch. But this fellow, if you don't give him your daughter, it's unclear that he's easily going to be able to find somebody else to marry. So lo avokazul. But Rav wasn't going to budge. Rav was not interested in having this fellow as a son-in-law. So now lo avokazul mikame, and this fellow would not leave. He would not leave. He's saying, Rav, I want to marry your daughter. Rav says, no, not happening. The fellow wouldn't leave. Yoav be'ene v'shochiv. So Rav looked at him and killed him. Rav Masna also allowed in Evin Ovid Kochavim Abba Bas Yisrael that the child could, is not a mamzer. Rav Yehuda also says the child is not a mamzer. Rav Yehuda Omarle, that there was a fellow who came before Rav Yehuda who was the child of such a union. Omarle Zil Itamar. Oh, Nosif Bas Minach. He says, look, unfortunately you're going to have a hard time finding a shidduch. Either go to some place where they don't know your lineage, and then you can get married there. So saying that basically he's not a mamzer, but you're basically around here. Everybody knows that your father's not Jewish, so it might be hard to find a good shidduch. But go to somewhere else where they don't know that, and then you can, then you can find a shidduch, or find somebody else who also has a similar situation as you, and whose mother's Jewish and father is not, and then get married to her. And when a fellow in this situation came before Rava, Rava says, Ogli o Nesiv Bas Minach, look, also you might have to go somewhere else in order to get married, or marry somebody who's in a similar situation as you, meaning, halachically speaking, you'd be allowed to marry any Jewish woman, although practically speaking, it might be difficult to find the shidduch, but we do see that the opinion seems to be that the child of an Ovid Kochavim or an Eved and a Bas Yisrael would be allowed to marry other Jewish women. Okay, so now we get to an interesting question. Friends, you ready for this? So the Taka sent the people of Beimichse. Alright, they sent to Rabbi Mishachetzu Ever V'Chetzu Ben Chorin Abba Bas Yisrael Mau. Let's say you have a fellow. He's half Canaanite slave and half free. I guess you have a fellow. He was a Canaanite slave. He had two masters, and one of them freed him, and one of them didn't. So he's half free, half slave, and he sleeps with a Jewish woman. Is that child a mamzer or not? Friends, what do you think? Omerle. So Rabbi responds, Hashta Evid Kuloi Aminan Kosher Chetsumi Boya. So Rabbi responds, says, look, we just said that if towards the end of the Gemara, it seems like the opinion, it seems like the Gemara is assuming that if you have an Evid or an Ovid Kochavim who's Ba Abbas Yisrael, so he said the child is kosher. So if you have a full Evid who's Ba Abbas Yisrael, the Vlad is kosher, a half Evid, obviously the child is going to be kosher. It's half as bad. So Rav Yosef Mar Deshmaita Manu, so which Rav Yosef says, well, it's not so simple, right? So Rav Yosef responds to Rabbi, says it's not so simple. Who is one of the opinions who says that in Eved who's Ba Bas Yisrael, the child is kosher? Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda is one of those opinions. For Rav Yehuda, but doesn't Rav Yehuda also say that in this case we have a fellow who is half Eved and half free? Abba Bas Yisrael also volod ein lo takone. Rav Yehuda says that in this case we have a Chetzio ben Chorin and Chetzio Eved, the child ein lo takone. So while on the one hand Rav Yehuda seems to be saying that when you have an Eved who's Ba Bas Yisrael, the child is kosher, but he also seems to be saying that when you have Mishachetzu Eved and Chetzu Ben Chorin, the child taka is a mamzer. So ki itmed Rav Yehuda kigon de kidesh bas Yisrael de nimtzo tzad avdus shebo mishtamish be'eshes ish. Friends, you hear that? So well, we can explain Rav Yehuda with the Chetzu Eved Chetzu Ben Chorin as the following: that this fellow, he's half slave, half free. He's mekadesh, a Jewish woman. He gives kesef kedushin to a Jewish woman. So what happens? So in that case, so the half of him that's free is married to this woman, but the half of him that's still a slave is sleeping with an Eishes Ish. Now, of course, a Jew who sleeps with an Eishes Ish, the child would be a mamzer. So we want to say that Kal V'chomer, if an Eved who sleeps with the Eishes Ish, so then that child would be a mamzer. So therefore, we want to explain that when Rav Yehuda says that somebody who's Chetzu Eved, Chetzu Ben Chorin, the Vlad is a mamzer, that's because he was mekadesh this woman, and therefore she's now an Eishes Ish, and then so the slave half of him will be sleeping with an Eishes Ish, which therefore means that the child would be a mamzer. So again, Kitmad Rav Yehuda, when Rav Yehuda says that the child of Chetzu Eved, Chetzu Ben Chorin would be a mamzer, could go in the Kidesh Bas Yisrael, that he was Mekadesh, the Kodesh Bas Yisrael, that he was Mekadesh, a Jewish woman, the Nimtzat Tzad Avdus Shabo, and now when he sleeps with this woman and they have a baby, so while yes, the free half of him is married to this woman, the slave half of him is Mishtamish Be'eshes Ish, is sleeping with a married woman, and therefore the child would be a mamzer. But for 1 second, but don't the Nardoi say, Mishmed Reb Yaakov, in the name of Reb Yaakov, that if you say that an Eved or an Oved Kochavim sleeping with a Bas Yisrael, the child is possible, that is regardless of if the woman is a married woman or an unmarried woman, and according to the opinion who says that the child is kosher, including Rav Yehuda, machsha afilu be'eshes ish, would say that the child is kosher even if it's an Eishes Ish. And therefore, to say that the reason why Rav Yehuda says by Chetzu Eved Chetzu Ben Chorin, the child is a mamzer, is because, well, the half that is a slave is sleeping with a married woman. Who cares? I mean, an Eved who sleeps with a married woman, according to the opinions who say that the child is kosher, the child would be kosher regardless if she is married or not. So meaning, and therefore even in this case where she's a married woman, the child would still be kosher even though she's sleeping with an Eved. And both opinions, right, meaning the opinion of saying that it's possible whether it's Eishes Ish or not, and it's kosher whether it's an Eishes Ish or not. So they both learn out from the wife of one's father. Man de Pasil, the Mandamru says that the child is a mamzer. So from Eishes Ov to Lotafsi bo Kiddushin avlad mamzer. Well, just like by your father's wife, that if you try to be mekadesh your father's wife, so then the child, so then there's no kiddushin there, that wouldn't work, and the child is mamzer. I've called lo tafsi ba kiddushin of lad mamzer. Therefore, even in any situation where there wouldn't be any kiddushin, such as like in Eved, in Oved Kochavim, the Bas Yisrael, there's no kiddushin, the vlad would be a mamzer, and that's regardless of if the woman is married or even not married, the child will be a mamzer, man the machsher. And the opinion who says that in Eved or in Oved Kochavim with the Bas Yisrael, the child is kosher, Sover, he holds ma'eshes of Diledide lo tafsi bo kiddushin, nachrini tafsi bo kiddushin, that when it comes to your father's wife, that you can't marry your father's wife, but other people can, I guess if your father dies or something like that. La'afuke Oved Kochavim ve'Eved lo tafsi bo kiddushin, to the exclusion of in Oved Kochavim and Eved where there is no kiddushin at all, right? There can't be any situation where there's halachic kiddushin within Eved and Oved Kochavim. So therefore, in that case, the child will be kosher whether it is a pnuya, whether it's a Eishes Ish. The child is going to be kosher because this is a situation where kiddushin cannot be chal whatsoever, and therefore. So if Rav Yehuda says that in Eved and Oved Kochavim who sleeps with the Bas Yisrael, the Vlad is kosher, so then that's regardless of if she is married or if she's not married. And therefore, how do we understand the situation of where there's a Chetzio Eved and Chetzio Ben Chorin who sleeps with the Bas Yisrael, and reviewed as saying that the child is a mamzer? The question is, why? We wanted to say that, well, because the Eved is sleeping with an Eishes Ish, but he says that an Eved with a Jewish woman, the child is kosher, regardless of if she's married or not. So Ela Kitma to Rav Yehuda, rather Rav Yehuda's opinion is Kigon Shebal Eishes Ish V'nimtzat Tzadcherus Shebo Mishtamish Be'Eishes Ish. So rather, actually, you'll say that Rav Yehuda's with the Chetzio Eved Chetzio Ben Chorin, it's actually talking about where he sleeps with an Eishes Ish, and in that case, while yeah, sure, the Eved half of him would not be a problem, right? Because Rav Yehuda says that by an Eved and a Bas Yisrael, even if she's an Eishes Ish, the child is kosher. However, the Jewish half of him is now sleeping with an Eishes Ish, and that's a problem, and that's why the child will be a mamzer. Omer Ravina, says Ravina, Omer li Rav Goza. So Ravina says that Rav Goza told him, Iklo Rav Yossi bar Oven, the Asin, Rav Yossi bar Oven visited our town, V'hava Uvda, Bifnuya v'achshu be'Eishes Ish u'fossil, and there was a situation where there was an Eved who slept with a Jewish woman. And so, in the case of where she was unmarried, he said the child is kosher. In the case where she was married, he said the child is posel. Which, of course, would go against what we just said a few minutes ago, that according to the opinion who says that the child is kosher, it's wet regardless of if the woman is married. And according to the opinion who says that the child is posel, it's also regardless of if the woman is married. So, Rav Sheshes Ladidi Amar li Rav Goza. So, it says Rav Sheshes that actually Rav Goza told him, Rav Yossi bar Oven Hava, it wasn't Rav Yossi bar Oven, Rav Yossi bar Zvido Hava, it was Rav Yossi bar Zvido, V'achsher bein b'pnuya bein be'Eishes Ish. And the Taka said no, that both by the unmarried woman as well as the married woman, he said that the child was kosher. Amalei Rav Acha prayed the Rav Ravino, says Rav Acha prayed the Rav to Ravino, Ikla Amemar la'asin, that Amemar visited our town, and he said that an Eved who sleeps with a Jewish woman, the child is kosher, whether the Jewish woman was married or not. The halacha is Ovid Kochavim ve'Eved haba Bas Yisrael, that if you have an Ovid Kochavim or an Eved who sleeps with a Jewish woman, avlad kosher, ben b'pnuya, ben be'Eishes Ish, the child will be kosher whether this woman is married or not. Rave Achrei Rav Mari bar Rochel Umanya bepursi de Bavel. Rave said that Rav Mari bar Rochel, who's Rav Mari bar Rochel? Apparently, he was the grandson of Shmuel. Shmuel unfortunately had a daughter who was taken captive, and when she was in captivity, she became pregnant with her captor from one of her Gentile captors, and she had a child, Rav Mari. And they call him after her rather than after him. So it says Rava Achsher. So the Gemara says Rava Achsher Rav Mari bar Rochel, that Rava said that Rav Mari bar Rochel was taka kosher. Mani before said the Bavel, and he even appointed them he appointed Rav Mari bar Rochel among the officers of Babylonia. V'afagavdar Mamar, even though we said Som Tos Malech Melech, that place upon yourself a king, Kol Mesimo Shatamesim Al Yehu El Mikar Vachecho, that all of the appointments that you make should be from among your brethren. But since Rav Mari bar Rochel's mother is Jewish, so it's considered from among your brethren, and that is why he could be an officer. That the servant of Rav Chia bar Ami, so he had a woman, an Ovedes Kochavim, go to the mikveh because she was a nida. Now the thing is, a Ovedes Kochavim doesn't need to go to the mikveh as a nida. So Rav Yosef Yechun bo v'varta. So Rav Yosef says, look, I can make an argument that she is kosher as well as her child. What does that mean? As well as her daughter from this union. Ba Rav Asi. So the reason why she is permitted, like Rav Asi, the Amar of Asi Milo Tava Linidusa, right? That she's going to the mikvah meaning she went to the mikvah because she was a nida. But the fact of the matter is, by Novedes Kochavim, who's a nida, she doesn't need to go to the mikveh, and therefore we treat it. Why did she go to the mikveh? L'shem gerus, as conversion, and therefore she's a Jewish woman, and therefore bebarta ovid kocham ve'eved abba bas Yisrael vlad kosher. It says of Yosef, I can argue that the child also, the daughter that is born, right, from this eved and this woman who went to the mikveh, this child would be kosher because it's basically an eved who sleeps with the bas Yisrael. The vlad is kosher. Dahavu karile bar Armiyasa. There was a certain fellow that they would call the son of a non-Jewish woman. Omer Rav Asi Milo Tovel Linidusa, says Rav Asi, but didn't she go to the mikveh, for being a nida, which Mimele we're treating as though she went to the mikveh to convert to Judaism. There was a certain fellow that they would call the son of a Gentile man, and says Rav Asi, well, says Rabbi Shua ben Levi, didn't he go to the mikveh for being a Balkari, and Balkari doesn't apply to Gentiles, so therefore Mimele we treated that he went to the mikveh to become a Jew, and therefore he's not the son of a Gentile, he's the son of a Jew. Alright, friends, well, that was Daf Mem-Hey of Masechta Yevamos. So we basically I'd say the big sugya that we spoke about today is what happens if an Eved or an Ovid Kochams Ba Bas Yisrael. So we saw two opinions, well, really two ways to view it. One, of course, is to say that the child is a mamzer. The other one is to say the child is kosher. But even if you say the child is kosher, it would at least be pogrom. It would not be allowed, right? If it was a girl, she wouldn't be allowed to marry a kohen. Then we talked about what happens in the case where you have somebody who's half slave and half free and who sleeps with the Bas Yisrael. So Rav Yehuda had said that the child is a mamzer, and we said that was because she was an Eishasish, and therefore, yes, while we had said that if you say that an Eved who sleeps with a Bas Yisrael, the child is kosher, that is regardless of if she is married or not. However, in this case, while the slave half of him sleeping with this married woman, the child would be kosher, but the free half of him would not be allowed to sleep with this married woman, and therefore the child is a mamzer. Alright, and we seem to be saying that if you have an Eved and a Bas Yisrael, the child would be kosher. Friends, that was Daf Mem-Hey of Masechta Yevamos. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.